It's well known that the Black Death, one of history's most devastating plagues, was transmitted by rats. But is that actually true? Well, it depends on what you mean by rats. In 1346, an outbreak of bubonic plague, which would come to be known as the Black Death, began in the British port city of Bristol. The disease spread quickly throughout the rest of England and then the rest of Europe, killing millions. And although the plague would eventually subside, its impact would have far-reaching consequences for the course of European history. But while it's commonly accepted that the plague was spread by rats, recent research suggests that these rodents were not alone. To understand how the plague ravaged Europe, we need to take a closer look at the pathogen itself. There are three main types of plague: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Bubonic plague is the most common form and is characterized by painful swelling of the lymph nodes, fever and chills, weakness and fatigue, headache, nausea, and vomiting. Septicemic plague is when the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, enters the bloodstream and rapidly overwhelms the immune system. This results in bleeding, organ failure, and widespread tissue necrosis, meaning that the affected body parts literally rot away. Finally, pneumonic plague occurs when the bacteria infect the lungs, leading to coughing, difficulty breathing, and bloody or watery sputum. All three forms can be deadly, but septicemic and pneumonic plague are generally fatal within a few days once symptoms appear. Historically, the Black Death was almost certainly bubonic plague, but the presence of other clinical signs meant that the line between the different forms was not always clear. While today we have effective treatments for plague, in the 14th century, there was little that could be done to stop its progression. In fact, the only treatments available were largely ineffective and sometimes even counterproductive. Bloodletting was a common practice at the time, and it was thought that the plague was caused by an excess of black or bad blood. So by removing some of the patient's blood, the theory went they would be cured. But this did nothing but weaken the patient further. So with no real treatments and no understanding of how the disease spread, people could only rely on their faith to pull them through. As grim as those odds are, though, it's possible they would have been even worse had it not been for a bit of good fortune. See, the most common way that plague bacteria are transmitted is through the bite of an infected flea. And although we now know that the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilochiapis, is the primary vector for the disease, that wasn't always the case. Oriental rat fleas usually infest Norway rats, which prefer to live in sewers and other dark, dank places. And it just so happens that these creatures are generally less inclined to cozy up to humans than their close cousins, the black rats. Black rats, on the other hand, love nothing more than to make themselves at home in human dwellings. They would often nest in clothing or in the folds of furniture, where they would gorge themselves on the blood of sleeping people. But here's the thing. Black rats don't really like sharing their homes. They're generally solitary creatures and will fight tooth and nail to defend their territory. Meanwhile, Norway rats are much more social, living in large groups known as colonies. It's thought that the unusually high population density of black rats in medieval Europe may have been the result of two factors. First, black rats typically have 2 breeding seasons per year, whereas most rat species only have 1. And second, black rats tend to cannibalize their prey. This means that in a given year, a single breeding pair of black rats could produce as many as 12 offspring, all of whom will survive to adulthood, whereas most other rat species only produce about 6 offspring every 2 years, with only half of them reaching adulthood. The result of these two factors combined is that black rat populations can grow much faster than other rat species, which may explain why they became so common in medieval Europe. And because black rats preferred to live in close proximity to humans, they brought the plague right into our homes. But they didn't do it alone. Fleas, lice, mites, and ticks also made themselves at home, on our person and in our beds. And these little critters were carrying diseases of their own, including epidemic typhus and relapsing fever. Now, this wasn't the first time these diseases had struck. Outbreaks of epidemic typhus, which causes high fever, weakness, rash, headache, and muscle pain, had occurred in Europe periodically since Roman times. Meanwhile, relapsing fever, which causes similar symptoms, plus intense shivering fits, had likely arrived in Europe via trading ships from Asia. But before the Black Death, these diseases were largely confined to the poorest and most overcrowded areas of big cities. The Black Death, on the other hand, would eventually kill an estimated 30 to 50% of the population across 3 continents. So while it's true that the Black Death was caused by rats, it's more accurate to say that it was transmitted by fleas, lice, mites, and ticks that lived on rats, humans, and the things we came into contact with. These tiny critters were vectors of some of the deadliest diseases known to man, and it was their bite that ultimately led to the deaths of millions. If you enjoyed this episode, stay tuned for more. Remember, don't blame the rats, blame the fleas.